Look down at Earth from space, and you won't see a single line anywhere. No red borders, no dotted boundaries, just oceans, mountains, rivers, and unbroken land, curving around a planet that has never once drawn a border on itself. Every political line on every map you've ever looked at was drawn by humans, and somehow those invisible, entirely constructed lines now decide what language you were taught, what passport you carry, what laws you live under, and, in the worst cases, who you're allowed to consider one of your own. How did an animal end up organizing its entire existence around lines that don't actually exist? Before there were countries, before there were kingdoms, before there was writing itself, there was something simpler and older, a tendency to sort the world into us and them. Many hunter-gatherer societies were organized into relatively small social groups, often nested inside much larger networks of kin, allies, and trading partners across a wider region. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar famously proposed that humans tend to organize social relationships in layers, with about 150 often cited as an upper layer of stable social connections. But the exact number remains genuinely debated, and newer analyses question whether there's any single hard cognitive ceiling at all, rather than a much fuzzier, more variable range depending on culture, environment, and individual circumstances. What does seem to hold up is the underlying pattern, not the precise number. Researchers have proposed that sensitivity to group membership, who counts as familiar and who counts as an outsider, may once have helped early humans navigate cooperation, competition, and conflict over resources like water, hunting grounds, and arable land. That's a real evolutionarily grounded psychological tendency. It's worth being careful, though, because that tendency explains something general and ancient: humans' habit of sorting people into groups at all, not the specific, much later invention of countries themselves. Tribalism is ancient. The nation-state is not. For most of human history, humans lived in relatively small groups, often moving seasonally through familiar territories, rather than living inside fixed, internationally recognized borders. That began to shift with the agricultural revolution. Farming made fixed settlements and long-term claims over particular places far more important than they'd generally been before, since a planted field, unlike a hunting ground, represented months of invested labor tied to one specific patch of earth. Fixed settlements needed defense. Defense needed organization. Organization needed rulers, and rulers needed some way to define exactly which land and which people actually fell under their authority. It's worth pausing on an important distinction here, because it's easy to blur together in hindsight. The earliest organized political territories, city-states in Mesopotamia, early kingdoms along the Nile and the Yellow River, the sprawling, shifting empires of the ancient and medieval world, weren't countries in any modern sense at all. Their boundaries were drawn around military reach, tribute networks, and the practical limits of how far a ruler's authority could actually be enforced on the ground, rather than around anything resembling the clean, fixed lines on a modern map. Borders in this era were porous and constantly shifting, less like the crisp edges of a modern country, and more like a gradient of steadily weakening control, radiating outward from a capital, fading into contested or unclaimed territory the farther you traveled from the throne. A person living at the edge of an empire might genuinely be unsure, from one decade to the next, which ruler they technically answered to. The Peace of Westphalia, a set of treaties signed in 1648 that ended the brutal 30 Years' War in Europe, is often presented as the single moment modern countries were born, the clean, textbook origin story. History, as usual, is messier than that. The treaties did help consolidate certain ideas that would go on to matter enormously, especially the notion of territorial sovereignty, the principle that a ruler holds exclusive authority over everything within a defined territory, and non-interference, the idea that outside powers shouldn't meddle in another state's internal affairs. But Westphalia didn't suddenly invent the modern nation-state overnight, and historians studying the period are increasingly clear about that. As late as 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, most of Europe was still organized into empires, kingdoms, and loose confederations, hardly resembling the clean, ethnically bounded nation-states people often picture when they hear the word country today. It took the collapse of European empires after the First World War, and then the brutal, forced reshaping of populations during and after the Second World War, to push most of Europe toward anything resembling the modern nation-state model. The modern idea of the nation-state developed gradually over several centuries and still doesn't perfectly describe most of the world. If Europe's borders evolved slowly through centuries of war and gradual gradual consolidation, the popular story about the rest of the world usually points to one single dramatic event, the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where representatives of 14 countries gathered in the German capital to formalize the rules for colonizing Africa, dividing the continent, so the popular version goes, with rulers on a map in one room in one winter, with African rulers largely excluded from the formal European negotiations. It's a striking story. It's also, according to recent scholarship, considerably more complicated than the popular version suggests. A detailed 2025 study published in the American Political Science Review examined 107 bilateral African borders and pushed back hard against the idea that these borders were simply decided at Berlin or that they were essentially random with respect to conditions on the ground. Historians of Africa have long rejected the seminal Berlin moment as an oversimplification. One researcher bluntly summarized the pushback as, "It didn't happen at Berlin," pointing out that the conference itself formally addressed only the Congo region and that most actual borders weren't finalized until years, sometimes decades, later, through separate negotiations that, the new research argues, correlated far more with existing pre-colonial political frontiers than the popular arbitrary straight line story usually admits. The study's own numbers are genuinely striking. Historical political frontiers, boundaries of existing pre-colonial states and kingdoms, directly influenced 66 of those 107 borders, roughly 62%. Straight geometric lines, the image most people picture when they think of colonial map drawing, turned out to be the primary defining feature of only around 37% of the borders studied. Water bodies, rivers, lakes, coastlines, features tied directly to the actual landscape, accounted for a larger share, roughly 63%, than the popular ruler across an empty map image usually suggests. The study's authors specifically noted that African agency in shaping these outcomes had been consistently underappreciated in the popular telling of this history. That doesn't erase the real harm colonial border drawing caused. Ethnic and cultural groups were still split across newly imposed lines in enormous numbers of well-documented cases. The Somali people remain divided across several modern states. Nigeria alone is home to more than 250 distinct ethnic groups, all drawn into a single colonial and later national boundary. Decisions were still made overwhelmingly by outside colonial powers, with minimal genuine input from the people actually living on the land. But the specific popular shorthand that a handful of men in a room in Berlin drew a ruler across a blank map in one afternoon and decided an entire continent's fate is a simplification that the best current research directly complicates. The reality was messier, more drawn out, and in a meaningful number of documented cases, more genuinely shaped by existing local political structures than the popular version usually allows. There's a deeper layer underneath all of this that helps explain why these lines, whatever their exact origin, feel so powerfully, emotionally real to the people living inside them. Political scientist Benedict Anderson called this an imagined community. You don't personally know millions of your fellow citizens and never will, yet you can feel genuinely and deeply that they belong to the same community as you, purely because you've all been taught to imagine yourselves as part of the same continuous story. Newspapers, shared language, schools, national history, flags, and public rituals all work together to turn millions of strangers into one imagined people. Whatever its exact origin, once a border exists, it stops being a historical accident and starts functioning as one of the most powerful forces in a person's actual life. The country you're born inside determines which passport you're issued, and that single document alone can shape which countries will let you enter freely and which will make you apply, wait, and justify your presence. It determines which government has the legal authority to tax your income, draft you into military service, or protect your basic rights, and which one has no jurisdiction over you at all the moment you step across an invisible line. It determines your access to healthcare systems, court systems, and voting rights, sometimes for your entire life, based on nothing more than where your mother happened to be standing the day you were born. And these lines, invented as they are far from permanently fixed. Modern history is full of borders that shifted dramatically within a single generation. Yugoslavia, one country for most of the 20th century, splintered into 7 separate nations nations within the span of about a decade. The Kurdish people, numbering in the tens of millions, remain split across the modern borders of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, a large culturally distinct population without a recognized country of their own, a direct living legacy of exactly the kind of border drawing this video has been describing. If a border can arbitrarily place you inside a country you never chose, there's an even stranger, harsher version of the same problem. What happens when no country claims you at all? According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, an estimated 4.5 million people worldwide were stateless at the end of 2025, meaning no country on earth legally recognizes them as a citizen. And that official figure is almost certainly an undercount, because many stateless people live in countries that don't systematically report statelessness data. The problem is also much broader than statelessness itself. The World Bank estimates that around 800 million people worldwide lack official proof of identity, a separate problem that can also shut people out of essential services and opportunities. Statelessness isn't a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. Without a recognized nationality, a person can be legally barred from enrolling in school, accessing basic health care, holding formal employment, registering a marriage, or owning property, locked out of nearly every system modern life depends on, not because of anything they did, but because the specific patchwork of national laws governing citizenship simply never accounted for their exact situation. An unrecognized border, a dissolved country, parents from two different nations whose laws happen to conflict. Worse, statelessness is frequently generational. A stateless parent often cannot pass citizenship to their child, meaning an entire family line can remain legally invisible to every government on earth for generation after generation, purely because of how a handful of lines happened to be drawn or redrawn at some point in the past. At the opposite extreme from statelessness, there's a small town on the Belgium-Netherlands border that shows just how strange these invented lines can get when they're taken completely literally. The twin towns of Baarle-Hertog and Baarle-Nassau are the product of a bizarre, centuries-old medieval land arrangement dating back to 1198 that left 22 small Belgian parcels of land scattered inside Dutch territory, with several Dutch pockets sitting inside those Belgian parcels in turn. The border doesn't just cut around buildings, it runs directly through them. Local authorities settled the confusion with a rule known as the Voordeurregel, the front door rule. Whichever country contains a building's front door is the country that building and its taxes officially belong to. One house at a location called Loveren has its front door positioned exactly on the border itself, and rather than force a decision, local officials simply gave the building two separate addresses, one Belgian, one Dutch, letting the owners choose which country's utilities and municipal services to use. The rule has produced genuinely strange history. During a formal 15-year survey project completed in 1995 to finally pin down the border's exact location, one specific boundary line shifted just enough to place a house's front door on the Dutch side of a line it had previously sat on the Belgian side of. Its elderly resident didn't want to move her residence to the Netherlands late in life, so a simpler solution was found. The front door and an adjacent window were swapped, placing the entrance back on the Belgian side of the border. It's an almost comedic illustration of the exact thing this entire video has been describing. A line invented centuries ago by two feuding medieval dukes, still today, deciding which government collects a specific family's taxes based on nothing more than which side of a door frame a door happens to be mounted on. It's worth answering the question this video actually opened with directly one more time. So why countries at all? Because once human societies grew too large for everyone to personally know everyone else, the old small-scale instinct for sorting us from them wasn't enough on its own to organize millions of strangers sharing the same land. Societies needed some system for organizing territory, authority, resources, taxation, security, and shared identity across populations no single person could ever fully know. Countries became one of the systems humans gradually developed for doing exactly that. Pull every thread of this story together, and the honest answer isn't one single cause. It starts with something genuinely old, a basic human tendency to sort the world into familiar in-groups and unfamiliar outsiders, likely useful once for navigating cooperation and competition in small communities. But that ancient tendency doesn't, by itself, explain modern countries. The nation-state, as we actually know it, is a comparatively recent, specific invention, one that took centuries to fully develop and still doesn't perfectly describe large parts of the world. Layered on top of that is a long, often difficult history of powerful outside states drawing lines through other people's land, sometimes with more attention to existing political realities than than the popular story admits, and sometimes with far less. And holding the entire structure together is a shared, actively maintained story. The idea that people who will never meet each other somehow belong together simply because a line was drawn around them and they were taught, generation after generation, to believe it mattered. None of that makes borders fake in any practical sense. They shape people's rights, safety, and opportunities in ways that are completely real, ways severe enough to leave millions of people with no recognized nationality at all, and specific enough, in one small European town, to hinge on which side of a doorframe a door happens to be mounted. But the border itself was never a fact of nature waiting to be discovered on the landscape. It was, every time, a decision made by particular people at a particular moment for particular reasons, some ancient and instinctive, some recent and deliberate, and none of them written into the physical earth at all. The next time you look at a map and see a country's outline, so familiar it barely registers as a choice anymore, it's worth remembering what you're actually looking at. Not a border the planet drew for itself, but the visible trace of an old, deep instinct to separate us from them, dressed up in treaties, wars, ink, and rulers, until an entirely invented line became one of the most powerful forces in a person's entire life.